All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. And welcome, everyone. It's truly a pleasure to be with you today. And I welcome you on behalf of the American Association of Colleges and Universities and the Center for Intercultural Learning, Mentorship, Assessment, and Research. And we thank you for joining us for this first in a series of global learning webinars. I'm Dawn Michelle Whitehead. I'm the Vice President of the Office of Global Citizenship for Campus, Community, and Careers at AAC&U. And we are so thankful for this collaboration with CILMAR. Our initial partnership started in 2019 when CILMAR, under Kris's leadership, convened a group to discuss professional development for interculturalists broadly defined. And by broadly defining interculturalists, it included people like me who were focused on global learning, but it also included those with an emphasis on intercultural competence, multicultural education, global education broadly, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it was a big tent. And we came together to discuss the unmet demand for professional development and mentorship in these spaces. And fortunately, with CILMAR, we have continued to collaborate and work on these intersections over the years. Most recently, this culminated into a think tank, working groups, and a publication on mentored undergraduate research in global context. And now we are partnering on this webinar series. Now, while this work is based on the work of the AAC&U VALUE initiative, this series is quite different in that it's not a scoring webinar series. Rather, it's meant to support the application of the rubric in ways that are unique to improving teaching and learning and integrating these important perspectives. Now, we want to introduce the series to you as well, and it's important to note that as a part of this series, we will be using the backward course design process. This, of course, is a process where you structure student learning based upon assessments that are intentionally designed to provide evidence that students are achieving course goals. So as instructors, you're considering the learning goals of the course first, and then these learning goals embody the knowledge and skills that instructors want students to have learned when they leave the course. And Kris and Horane will tell us a little bit more about that throughout the session. Now, what we're doing as a part of this webinar series is we are focusing on two of the value rubrics, the Intercultural Knowledge and Competence rubric and the Global Learning rubric. And we will be doing this, as you may be aware, throughout a 7-part webinar series. And you can see we've got webinars that are already scheduled for this summer and this fall, and you can see the range of facilitators who will be leading these sessions. And then we will also have 4 webinars in the winter and into the spring time period. Today, of course, we will be focusing on the dimension of investigating the attitude of openness, and we hope you'll join us for the future webinars as well. With that, I'd like to turn it over to today's facilitators, Dr. Kris Acheson-Clair and Dr. Horane Diatta-Holgate. So I'll turn it over to you two.
Thank you so much, Dawn, for the introduction. So Horane and I are really excited to be here today. We have sort of a learning plan for you with some objectives. Just to give you a heads up, we've kind of have divided this session into 3 different sections. We're going to start with the conceptual and really talk about the operationalization of openness. And then our largest chunk of time will be very engaging, hopefully, and demo some activities that with backward design we can use to hopefully foster those learning outcomes. And then we'll end with assessments before we go to a Q&A time and wrap up the session. And so here's what we're hoping that you get out of the session today. The openness construct and understanding of that, some practice and exposure to various learning activities, and then some ideas for how to assess openness. Again, you'll see this idea of backward design reflected in these outcomes. You start with the construct, and then you talk about how you get there in the end goal. And of course, how you know whether you've gotten there. All right. So one thing I want to mention before we get started, just in terms of tech, as we go through, we have moments of engagement like polls and chat questions for you. And so we hope that you will engage with us with those. We do not have a breakout room today, so some of you can breathe a sigh of relief about that. But we do have a separate Q&A function open in your toolbar. So if you look at Zoom there at the bottom, probably of your screen, you'll see that Q&A button. And we would like to reserve that for the Q&A session at the end. So if throughout the session, if you have sort of tangential questions or want more details about things, or have an idea sparked for something you'd like to talk about in the Q&A session at the end, no matter what timing it is through the workshop, please enter those questions into that Q&A forum, and that's going to keep track of that and bring us back to that at the end. And that way it stays separate from the chat that we're going to use for the activities. Okay. So I'm going to turn it over to Horane now to talk about the construct of openness.
Thanks, Kris. So as Kris mentioned, we want to start with definitions. My colleagues who are usually working together say that Horane is a definitionist, because I think when we know what we're talking about and we have clear understanding, we could formulate the goals and we could be more intentional in the assignments and activities that we choose. So this comes straight from the Intercultural Knowledge and Competence value rubric, the openness construct. And I'm looking at capstone 4. For those who are familiar with the rubric, they're the different levels that taking a very developmental approach that as you do different activities and engage with them, you're able to work through to see where you are. We'll talk a little bit more about the developmental approach later. But at capstone 4, I've bolded the 2 parts of intercultural openness that I think are really important, that helps us to focus in on our goals and then potential activities. So initiating and developing interaction with those who are culturally different, and then suspending judgment. So reserving judgment during interactions with those who are culturally different than we are. And I think when you think about these 2 components, just conceptually, it really helps you be more focused. Also, to operationalize them, as you'll see later in the session when we talk about assessment, you could use different statements to get at these things to different depths and to varying degrees. Kris, you can look at the next slide. So in developing the AAC&U rubrics, I've had the privilege to talk to some of the people who worked on the rubrics. And one of the important models was Darla Deardorff's pyramid model for intercultural competence. And I found this to be a valuable tool in my own work, thinking about at the top level, the desired external outcome, intercultural knowledge and competence, being able to communicate effectively and appropriately. But to get to that point, some of what Darla Deardorff calls the requisite attitudes at the bottom of the pyramid is this idea of openness, curiosity, respect. And openness is just, as it says there, withholding judgment, similar to the definition. And the notes section, I want to point this out because I think it's really valuable. And as we think about how we structure a session or design an experiential learning experience, being very clear about how we scaffold the activities for different people, and the definitions help us to do that. So if our desired external outcome is communicating effectively and appropriately across differences, then openness is one of those attitudes that we need to start with cultivating. And that's what calls a requisite, right? Yeah, next slide. So we also, as Kris and I were designing this, we realized that, the term openness has, depending on your disciplinary background, I know we have a range of people here today. My background is in educational psychology and research methods. So in psychology, sometimes openness could be associated with sort of a trait, and it's static and related to personality. That is really not what we're talking about here, but we're looking specifically at intercultural openness, which is more dynamic, more developmental, as you saw with the rubric. Some other assessments that use the intercultural approach to openness, the beliefs, events, and values inventory, which is one that Kris is very familiar with, and myself and probably others on the call. But there are these 2 ideas related to openness: basic openness, honesty about our internal processes, and then sociocultural openness, thinking about our relationships to others. So self-awareness and other awareness in that way. And then other 2, we'll get into 2 of these actually, the M goods, which in some sense sort of connects to this idea, the attitude of curiosity, which if you go back to the Deardorff's model, curiosity was one of those requisite, so it's interest in engaging with others. So this idea of initiating, welcoming, being open to different interactions with people who are different than you. And then this last one, tolerance for ambiguity. We have sort of flagged this as a related construct because oftentimes when we think about being in another culture or communicating with someone who is different, there can be some discomfort. Some of it may be tied to personality or just awareness of the cultural context itself. So tolerance for ambiguity, which means being comfortable in sort of uncomfortable situations and things that are not so clear cut, which if anyone has traveled to a different country or just, I'm originally from Jamaica, and I often tell people that the US is very large and I could go from the Midwest to the South and have a completely different cultural experience because that's what it is. And you can experience that across borders internationally as well as within your country. All right, next slide. Yes. All right.
So that's sort of a basic introduction to the concept of openness. We're going to, again, thinking through this in terms of backward design. We talked about the end goal, this learning outcome that we'd like to have for our learners of openness. And we had touched briefly on how those constructs are related to various instruments that we're going to spend some time talking about how you actually use those at the end of the session. But we're going to do a deep dive into some options for how you actually help people to develop openness, because there are tons of tools out there. And not only is it difficult to put your finger on which is the most appropriate for your context, but also sometimes we might have varying levels of comfort with facilitating different types of activities. So just to give you a brief overview, we're going to talk about and experience today together a couple of different types of activities. And one is dialogue-based activities, and one is more experiential learning type activities. And we're going to demo a couple of these, but we're also going to give you a lot of other ideas and suggestions that are located within the Intercultural Learning Hub. And that way you'll be able to check out some additional options beyond the ones that we have actually time to experience together today. And just for the ease of your access to these, the links are all here in the slides, of course, but we have collected all of these different resources today from this section and from the assessment section into a collection in the Intercultural Learning Hub at hubicl.org. And we're going to share that one link with everybody by email afterwards, so that you have all the resources collected in one place for your future use. Okay, so we're going to start with this activity called plus minus null. And if you've been in this area, in this field for a while, or if you've studied with anybody who is a pioneer in this field, like Janet Bennett or Meg Vandenberg or someone like that, you probably were exposed to an activity called DIE, Describe, Interpret, and Evaluate. It's classic. It's really effective at fostering openness and perspective taking. This is kind of a different take on that activity. There are lots of other alternatives to the DIE, and so we've listed a few here: the DAE, the DIVE, the iDive, all sort of related tools that have similar purposes, just a little bit different approach. And so you can check those out in the Hubicle. But with that introduction, I think we should try it. So when we do plus minus null, the basic idea is that we're trying to get people to gauge how they're interpreting a situation, an event, an interaction, something that they are experiencing, and try to determine whether or not their sort of gut reaction to that is positive, negative, or neutral. And then to get them to sort of imagine and explore other possible interpretations by deviating to the other potential options there. So if they start with positive, then they should try to imagine a negative interpretation and evaluation, or a neutral interpretation evaluation. So just to be clear, if you remember the DIE premise, we would describe something that we're experiencing, interpret it, and evaluate it. And those are three different things. So description is just the facts, ma'am, right? Interpretation is the meaning that we're assigning to that. And evaluation is the valence of it, whether it's positive or negative, and sort of what our judgment of it is. So this is really getting more at the interpretation and evaluation and not focusing so much on the description piece of it. But it is really encouraging that imaginative approach to perspective taking. Okay, so let's try it out. I'm going to show a picture to everybody, and then I've got some things that I want you to do. If everybody would find your reaction buttons now, that would be really helpful before I share this picture, because as soon as I show you the picture and then take it away, I'm going to ask people to use your reaction buttons to either give me a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or nothing at all. And that's going to signify, so if I show all the videos on the screen, we should be able to see kind of a gauge the room, kind of a feel for how people are interpreting this picture and whether that's giving them a positive, a negative, or a neutral evaluation. So if you'll find the button on your Zoom controls somewhere where it says reactions, you should be able to see those thumbs up, thumb down, okay? And then also find your chat button, because I'm also going to ask you to type in what you think is actually happening in this picture. So that's the interpretation piece. The thumbs up, thumbs down, or neutral is the evaluation piece, and the typing to chat is the interpretation. Okay, so here we go. Here is your picture. Okay, so just take a second, glance at it. Okay, so the first thing I want you to do, and I actually can't see the cameras on my screen because I'm sharing my slideshow, so I'm going to ask Horane to just keep an eye on the videos and get a sense, read the room and see what the sort of balance is between positive, negative, and neutral here. So use your reaction buttons and go ahead and indicate if you had a positive reaction to that, a negative reaction to that, or just kind of a neutral, no strong emotions attached, okay? And I'll show you the picture again while you're doing that.
Good mix of positive and negative, very few neutral I'm seeing.
So a mix of positive and negative. Great. Okay. Great. I can't decide if she's dancing or being mugged. Yes. So go ahead now and type. What do you think is actually happening in this picture? Put your assigning of meaning, interpret what it is that you're seeing here. And of course, we understand, hopefully everybody understands that our interpretation is very influenced by our past experiences and the cultural lenses that we're looking through. All right, so we see lots of dancing. We've got some holding hands. We've got some different interpretations of the facial expression, maybe. We've got, yeah, somebody grabbing her purse. Yeah, she's being helped. I love it, running to avoid the paparazzi. Great. So we're going to put on sort of a teacher's hat now and do sort of a meta level debriefing, because and you can take this and make it a really complex, hour-long activity if you want to and get really involved. But oh, sorry, I wanted to show you something first here. So before we get into the debriefing, I just want to add one more little element to it. So like I just said, you can make this really complex and think about all the different contextual factors that might influence people's interpretations, right? So this is just a video that has the same imagery, but with 3 different soundtracks. And so if you can imagine, if we look back at that picture that you were looking at before, and it had these 3 separate soundtracks, how would you maybe perhaps change your interpretation and evaluation? Okay. So let's do a sound check. Can everybody actually hear that? so that's the first one. Or if it's just or if it's different music. Okay, so I'm going to go back again to the picture here. If we had sort of happy music or just the natural soundtrack of what's happening, and again, that could be very different if she were dancing or if she were being mugged, right? Or she's hiding from the paparazzi or any of the other explanations that y'all put up there. Or if there was this sort of more eerie soundtrack, you know, how might that shape your interpretation and evaluation? And I'm curious in this point, if you would, again, with your teacher's hat on, if you would brainstorm with me what other potential factors might be influencing your interpretation and evaluation. Right, we can't see her face, so it's inherently ambiguous. We can read her posture. We can have kind of the ambiance of whatever else is happening in the picture, but one of our big cues with her facial expression is mostly hidden. So our own gender. These are some really great comments coming up in here. So our age, our gender, these things that have shaped our past experiences are probably really coloring how we see this. Oh, I really love this. So observer's emotional state, like if I'm in a different mood when I look at this picture, as opposed to a different time when I look at this picture, it could really shape how I'm seeing it, interpreting it. Excellent. Yes, past trauma. Oh yeah, good. If we could see more of the background, it's blacked out for the most part, right? Which again could be shaping it, like a daylight versus nighttime could have a very different feel. Yeah, very good. Excellent. Just the fact the picture is in black and white and not in color makes it feel sort of like old, right? Which may have, again, different evaluations for different people. Excellent. Right, if these were people that we recognized, or if we could see the people on either side of her to get more information about what's going on. These are all really great thoughts. Thank you for contributing. Okay, so I'm going to go to this debriefing now. Where did it go?
I think it was a skip slide.
Oh, no. Okay, I'll go with this one. Okay, so let me do just a quick debriefing with this. So one advantage to me to doing the DIE activity is that it really gets people to understand that when they are reacting to events, all of that is mixed up together and they're not consciously separating them. And so anytime they describe something, it becomes very obvious that actually their interpretation and evaluation is embedded in that description. But to me, the advantage of this plus minus null is that it really gets you to focus on not just recognizing your interpretation and evaluation, but realizing how many other potential interpretations and evaluations that there are. Okay, so as part of this debriefing, I want you to just take a moment and reflect. And if your initial interpretation was positive or negative or neutral, I want you now to actively, take those other perspectives. And then we're going to talk sort of at a meta level about how challenging or easy that was for you. Okay, so you can scroll back through the chat if you want some ideas about what other alternative interpretations there are beyond your initial gut instinct, or you can sit there and imagine more for yourself. But just take a moment to do that reflection, and then I'm going to ask you to reflect again in chat.
Kris, if you could just briefly repeat the question and I'll type it in chat just so for some people who missed it.
Yes. So what I'm asking to reflect on is how easy or challenging it is to do this imaginative perspective taking and really feel the validity of these other possible interpretations beyond your initial gut reaction to it. So when you're ready, you can go ahead and type into chat any answers that you have to that question. And as a follow-up to that question, as you're thinking about how easy or challenging that perspective taking was for you with this particular picture, I want you to think about what could be more challenging with an activity like this. In other words, are there contexts in which you could apply plus, minus, null as a framework that would really get people to recognize that there are other ways of experiencing something that they just experienced? Yeah, it is amazing how our first impression gets stuck in our head, right? Interesting point. I think it is easier to go from neutral to positive and negative. It might be more challenging sometimes to go from a very strong emotional reaction to the opposite. So maybe if you're positive, it's not so terrible to go to neutral, but it might be difficult to go to negative and vice versa. So negative might be okay to go to neutral, but hard to go to positive. Really good insight in the chat here. Thanks for contributing. So ideas about applications of an activity like this, where something is inherently more challenging. Like the thing that comes to mind for me is you watch a political speech in our current climate, right? And you have an immediate gut reaction that's very positive or very negative. How challenging would that be to come up with those alternate interpretations and grant them validity? If you have a very positive or a very negative experience in a new cultural context, how does this framework address the challenge of perspective taking there? Yeah, really good point too in the chat about the ambiguity of the situation, because it is very ambiguous, and so maybe it's easier to do the perspective taking when we are pretty sure we think what has happened. Maybe this is more challenging. Yes, exactly. So if we recognize an image or we see something that we think we really have a handle on, we have the right interpretation of, then we're really sold on our evaluation of it, right? And so the interpretation and evaluation is really tied together. In order to choose a different evaluation to go, for example, from negative to positive or vice versa, we actually have to let go of our interpretation as well and come up with other possible interpretations. Yes, and when you're involved and not just an observer. Excellent points. All right, just for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and move on. I did want to give you some alternatives. Oh, it's the next slide after the 5 nosy questions. So we're going to go ahead and move to the next activity. This one is, instead of an experiential activity like plus minus null, this is a dialogue-based activity. And like the last one, there are lots of similar activities that could be deployed for similar purposes. Basically, the point of these kinds of activities is storytelling, but storytelling at a deeper level, storytelling that that doesn't just stay at a surface sort of individual level, but taps into who people are as cultural beings. I see some requests in the chat to know what was happening in the photo. And typically when I do DIE or plus minus null, I refuse to tell people what the real answer is, because then people get caught up in trying to be accurate when actually the point of activity is to try to get multiple perspectives and recognize the validity of all of them. So I tried to stay away from answering that question.
And I'll just add one thing to that. So if we think back to the definition of openness, intercultural openness, this activity focused on that second piece, sort of the suspending judgment. And as Kris said, if you do reveal the answer at that point, the related construct also, tolerance for ambiguity, it's going to be a bit uncomfortable. And so we're putting you in a state of discomfort here. But it's really part of it. And it's good to ask, but I'd say leaving it open allows people to actually develop the capacity to see those different perspectives, to suspend judgment. I think Sandra had a comment in the chat about just forcing yourself to interpret the situation in another way, considering all the different possibilities that exist. And it's an attitude, as something that we develop over time. And so the more of these situations that you can expose people to, students, learners in a training, will help them to develop that capacity. So I'm with Kris. We're gonna hold off on the. You can make up as many scenarios.
Yeah. So as Horane mentioned, thinking about backward design and always aligning back to the construct that we're trying to promote. The other aspect of openness beyond just suspending judgment and being open to different perspectives or interpretations of things, different ways of experiencing the world, is openness to actually interacting across those differences. And so this is the more interpersonal. The other one's a lot more cognitive and affective. And this one taps into the behavioral because we're asking people in these to actually engage with other people. And so it's dialogic, it's narrative, it's storytelling, and it's that personal side of openness where we're actually, connecting in our humanity with other people. So 5 nosy questions. It's basically a set of discussion prompts. And again, we're not trying to do sort of very surface level things. We're really trying to inspire questions or discussions that tap into who people are as cultural beings. And it can be challenging sometimes because we don't want to promote stereotypes and we don't want to, have essentialism happening and overgeneralization. And so there's a balance to be found here in activities like this where we really have to frame our discussions as letting people be both individuals and members of cultural groups. So this particular activity is in the Hubicle. Here's a couple of alternatives as well, but we're going to try out a demo. And so Dan, our tech host, is going to share a poll with you. And basically, Horane and I, just for the sake of time, so we don't do breakout rooms, we're going to fishbowl this for you. So we're going to demo it. We have not practiced, I promise. And we're going to give you control over what we talk about. So if you will take that poll and choose one of these questions for Horane and I to, to fishbowl for you, then we will give you a demo.
All right, which question won? Because I think I missed.
It looks like what do you most appreciate about the way you were raised is the winner at 31%. All right, so when you do dialogues, let's just to put the teacher's hat on for a second before we start. When you do a dialogue like this, framing is really important, and you really want to encourage people not just to ask and answer questions, but to actually talk to each other. And so if you can set this up as a dialogue, as a discussion where the prompt starts the conversation, but it doesn't just stop after the person has answered the question, that's best. And so that's what we're going to try to model here for you. So I'm going to start this off by asking Horane the question, and then we'll go from there. So Horane, what do you most appreciate about the way that you were raised?
Yeah, I think for me, I was raised in Jamaica in the Caribbean, and what I appreciate most is, especially in that context, was as a boy growing up in my household, I wasn't just allowed to go outside and play and do everything. So I also had to do housework. So I had to clean the bathrooms, wash the dishes, cook, all of those things. So it allowed me to develop those things, which was not always as common in my cultural context growing up. It would be sort of, there's this gender socialization happening where girls would stay in the house and boys would go outside and do the yard work. I had to do both. And as I got older, I appreciated that. And I joke with my wife that I have an excellent domestic CV, so that I can do a lot of things around the house and both in the yard. What about you? How do you
That's awesome. Before I answer, I just have a quick follow-up question
Yeah, sure.
because it sounded like from what you said that was not very usual actually in the Jamaican context. So your friends, your peers were not kind of growing up that way with that skill set?
Yeah, not majority of my friends, guys, were not in that similar environment. So I was able to take on a lot of responsibility in my household as a child, which was also not very common in the context. Sort of your parents sort of told you what to do and then you did it. And that was it. So in that context, I had a lot of autonomy and choice, which I still had to do what I was told, yes, but just over my overall development, which, yeah, I would say in my peer group and where I grew up, that was not common.
And so when you've spent a lot of time here in the US, you've been here for what, a decade or more, right?
Yeah.
So how do you find that compares with your peer group here?
I think over time I don't know, that's a tough one. I'd have to think on that a little bit more. The comparison isn't as clear because, as I said earlier in the session, there have been moments where different parts of the US I experienced different things, and just the culture is so rich and vast, with the different ethnic and racial identity groups and so on, and how those socialization and family life are just so varied that I can't sort of pinpoint a sort of one-to-one. But yeah, it's
There's a
interesting.
lot of variation. So
I'm curious about Southern Georgia, Kris. Tell me.
Your comments really resonated with me because I kind of had the opposite thing going on. I grew up in a military family. It's all girls in my family except my poor dad, like really totally outnumbered. So all girls that they had, and they fostered several girls, and then I have only girls. My sister has only girls. So just surrounded by women. And so anything that would in other maybe more typical US American households, working class and middle class households, would have been considered sort of boy things to do. We did all the time because there were no boys around. And so, I learned to fly, and I can do anything construction related. I can do tile and plumbing and electrical work and, woodwork and all those kinds of things. I'm not a very good mechanic, but but I can drive a tractor. So yes, I think the disruption of gender norms in the opposite direction was very much describes my family and the way that I was raised.
Okay, that's helpful. I know we have to end soon, but I'm curious to hear about this as a follow-up. Like, how did that experience in your family and what you've learned growing up around gender, how did that shape your worldview, your professional career, what you decided to do, what you do now? So
yeah, I think maybe not in terms of career choice, but in terms of how I perform my role in my career. I'm always very conscious of gender and sort of intentionally subvert or push back against gender norms that I encounter, not only because oftentimes it affects me in detrimental ways, and so I'm resistant to that out of got my back up about it, but even for people that I mentor and And even the gender norms that impact males in, I think, unfair ways. I push back against because of that early experience where they shouldn't be things that hold you back.
Yeah, nice. And scene.
All right, so we're going to debrief a little bit here. Let me share my screen again. Thank you for watching our demonstration so patiently. All right. Okay, so some debriefing prompts for you here. Let me get rid of my menu. There we go. Okay, so let's talk about your feelings. If you're willing to type into chat, any emotions that you experienced while you were watching this demo, or if you could put yourself in our place, what you feel like you might have experienced if you were actually performing in a dialogue such as this. Or you can put yourself in the place of your learners and describe how you think that your learners would feel participating in a dialogue like this. So anything related to emotions, we're just handling question number 1 right now. Anything with emotions, your own emotions, watching us, your own emotions imaginatively if you were participating, or your learners' emotions if they were participating. While you're thinking about that and typing, there's an excellent question in the chat about how much time to give people. And I would say minimum 1 minute per person per question. So if there are 5 questions and 2 people, you need 10 minutes. If there are 5 questions and 3 people, you need 15 minutes. Does that math make sense? And Horane, I don't know if you have a different formula that you use for things like this. That's bare minimum, by the way.
Yeah, I tend to go more time just because of the dialogue component and the opportunity to follow up. So I use a version, something kind of called serial testimony, where you're intentionally practicing listening as well as part of this activity, just being present so that you're not sometimes when you give students these things, they'll tend to be thinking about their answers. And even when we were preparing, I tried to not look at the questions to prepare an answer so it would be as natural and authentic as possible. So giving people time and the moments of pause. So I would probably go 2 to 3 minutes. And just a quick note on this, depending on the types of questions you end up asking, just being mindful of what it might invite people to bring up, reflection on childhood and so on. So you kind of have to leave space for that. And I like to, just so it's just not so much question and response, but there is space to unpack some things and for people to feel their emotions as they talk. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a great comment in here about people who've had childhood trauma. And I think you could give, whatever you want to call it, a trigger warning or something in your framing that gets people to share as much as they're willing to share while engaging in self-care. So there are obviously things that nobody wants to talk about the way that they're raised or their cultural experiences. And there are also things that will bring up so much negative emotionality for them that it's not worth it for them to talk about it in that context. And so some sort of guidance for participants about how much they share or how much they think about particular things that come up for them in this activity would be wise. So we're kind of jumping down to the question number 3 here, but that was a good comment here.
In terms of structure, just addressing some of the things that I'm seeing in the chat, I think pairs are a good way to do this, especially people who are from different backgrounds, because earlier we were looking at suspending judgment, right? And this is an opportunity to practice initiating interactions with people who are culturally different. So, it's called 5 nosy questions, and the sort of, Kris and I were discussing sort of the level of this and the depth that it requires is just a little bit deeper, that we have to be very intentional about the types of questions, in terms of scaffolding it, what do students need to know? What other skills they need to develop, such as listening? You could also use the activity. You could also sort of scaffold it in a way where there is sort of 5 nosy questions light, where it's just general questions to start with to get things moving, and then get into more deeper questions. There are different ways to approach it, but being mindful of the structure and the framing, as Kris was saying, is a way to move forward.
Thank you for all these wonderful comments. I did put the time formula in there because we got a prompt about that. And again, that's my basic minimum. There's lots of variation on that for various contexts and contextual reasons. Let's move on for the sake of time to these second and third questions. I'm going to put the questions themselves back up here for you to think about that second question and the third question. So the second question is really like editing, because not all these questions are good all the time for all people in all settings, right? We really should tweak them in various ways, or not use them at all for various situations. But the third question is, what could you say to learners ahead of time to really set them up for success with this activity? So please feel free to share in chat any ideas that you have about editing questions or framing them well for participants. And meanwhile, let me go ahead and put the questions themselves back up for you. So one more time, the two questions are, how would you change the questions themselves? And how can you frame them for success? Frame the activity for success. Yes, good. Community agreements, wonderful. Yes, talking about stereotypes in a proactive, preventative kind of way would be great. Yeah, so there's a comment here about sort of introverted students or students who are feeling vulnerable for one reason or another. And this is one thing to think about when you put people together, both in terms of who you're putting together and the number of people that you're putting together. So sometimes a group of 3 might put a little bit less pressure on everyone to talk more extensively. I think sometimes that's also difficult because you don't want 2 people to really feel like they have a lot in common and the third person not so much, and be sort of otherized in that context. So there's lots of things to consider there, and there's no probably perfect solution to an issue like that. But I think the best thing to do is try to create the safest space that you can, and then encourage people to be brave within those safe spaces. So some of that is creating community amongst your learners before you even move into an activity like this. I love Aletha's idea of presenting choice. So you might say there's 5 questions here. You need to try to talk at least about 3 of them, and you can pass on things that you're not comfortable talking about or don't interest you. Yeah, great. Good comments. Yes, right. When people don't have necessarily a home community, I think there's probably a way to present these questions and set up the framing as you don't have to choose one culture to identify with whenever you're answering these questions. The point is to talk about yourself as a cultural being, which is probably very, very complex. Excellent. I'm going to make a note to myself to add examples of community agreements to the collection that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so again, in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and just give you a very brief intro to a number of other activities along the same lines. So remember, we said there were dialogue-based activities, and those are the more interpersonal, the more, sort of human side of things. And then the experiential activities are more about the cognitive and the affective, where we're trying to develop that suspending of judgment and the sort of openness to other perspectives, right? So with the dialogue-based activities, here are a few options beyond the ones that we specifically mentioned along with the 5 nosy questions. So story stitch, story circles, those are both frameworks for taking diverse groups and giving them a structure to guide discussion and dialogue within smaller groups. So you take a large group, break them down into smaller groups, and it gives a way for them to interact with each other and get to know each other as cultural beings and share experiences and gain insights across cultural differences. So those are both ones that I would recommend. Story Stitch has the advantage of being able to be done online as well as in person. Story Circles is the one that Darla Deardorff developed, and it's not supported by, but disseminated by, I don't know what word you would use there, by UNESCO. So that's a popular option. Counter storytelling is a little bit more advanced. I use this one with graduate students, with faculty groups. If you have any more advanced learners, it's a really good activity for getting people to think deeply about what common narratives they hear about cultural groups, and then to either find or tell their own counter narratives that bring different perspectives and give a more nuanced understanding of cultural experiences, and get at things beyond that sort of essentialized, monolithic, dominant narrative kind of approach. And then Crossing Borders Education Peer Dialogues. If you're not familiar with Crossing Borders Education, it's a nonprofit out of the UK that does a lot of really wonderful media work, but they have this this peer dialogue methodology that has media embedded in it, and I cannot enough highly recommend it, because I have witnessed it really, opening up people so that they're more willing to dialogue. There's some secret sauce in there that when people see their peers in a video dialoguing about what they're about to dialogue about and modeling that, it really like immediately jumpstarts the conversation for them in a way that is kind of magical. So if you haven't seen that, check that out, because it's a great methodology. And then the experiential activities that we wanted to highlight very briefly. These are some of my favorites that I assign to learners all the time. Language envelopes, just to talk in terms of pros and cons. It's one of my favorites because it's very experiential. It's very hands-on. There's like objects that people are sort of playing with and fiddling with. And I've never done it where people haven't had these epiphanies of like, it's amazing how many different ways to organize objects there are. And we have this gut instinct to organize them in a particular way that's often shaped by the language that we speak and the culture we come from. But there are lots of other valid ways to organize them as well. And so an activity like this that is hands-on and really sort of exploratory is a great way to open people up to different interpretations, different perspectives, different ways of experiencing the world. But the cons are, because it's experiential, it has all these things that are there, is that it does take quite a bit of preparation to get it together. And once you have it done, you can use it over and over. But meanwhile, you've got to collect all those little objects for them to play with. So grocery store ethnography and YouTube ethnography, these are, and really Amazing Race, these are more send people out into their local environment to do things and then reflect on them. And they have different approaches. YouTube one is obviously online. Amazing Race uses photography. Grocery store ethnography, is set in a food scenario. But they all are sort of getting people to be more aware of how they are interpreting things, and then how local interpretations might be very different from their own. So those are some dialogue-based and experiential activities. Again, we are going to provide all these links to you in that collection I mentioned on the Intercultural Learning Hub. So don't feel like you have to write down those links, because they're all there for you to just click on. So I want to take a few minutes before we turn to assessment to get you to share, because I know a lot of you are experienced professionals that you facilitate intercultural learning, global learning, and other related overarching learning outcomes that include openness all the time with learners. And so if you have any favorites that we have not mentioned, please take this moment to share them into chat. And in the meantime, the Hubicle, so if you created a Hubicle account long ago, it's important for you to know that we have opened it up, open access, so you no longer need to log in to the Hubicle to access anything in terms of downloads. The only time you actually need to be logged in is if you are contributing something nowadays. So you'll be able to click on the one link that we send you to the collection and even share it with other people, and nobody needs to actually have an account in the Hubicle to access them. All right, so favorites. Anybody have anything that they want to share in chat, a name or description of an activity? If you feel comfortable, you're also welcome to unmute your mic and actually describe an activity for us. Specifically, hopefully related to openness. While you're typing and thinking about that, we have just a couple of slides that we want to talk about in this backward design kind of a vein about how you might want to go about choosing openness activities. And yeah, I can't remember if this was you, Horane, or if the next slide was you.
Yeah, this one's me too. Yeah,
Okay.
I got you. So I kind of hinted at this in as we were debriefing the 5 nosy questions activity. So remembering sort of which component of openness are you looking at in deciding on the activity, and knowing the specific goals that you have and the outcomes that you want for students. Thinking through, so the question about how much time to give students and so on, we've sort of put out a list of things here that you might consider: the time, the resources, your own capacity and risk for vulnerability, your identity, students' identities, the medium of instruction, online, face-to-face, hybrid. So all those things are really important to consider when deciding on an activity. But it really starts with the goals. What do you want students to be able to do? If it's to initiate, and at what level, it's at the beginning. So if it's early in the semester, early in the learning experience, we might consider doing one of the experiential activities, or a lower level, less vulnerability, risk type of activity that gets them talking to one another. A lot of people in the comments mentioned about building community. So those are factors one would need to consider as you do it. Any other thoughts? Anything anyone would like to add? Something that we missed in terms of consideration, or something you consider as you design your experiences and activities? All right, Kris, you can go to the next slide. Feel free to post in the chat. Implementation. These 3 things are really valuable in terms of learners' background and prior experiences interacting with people who are culturally different. So as we choose an activity, we don't want to induce anxiety, trauma, or anything like that. We want people to be uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable to the point that they are unable to engage. So think of the anxiety curve. Someone has too much anxiety. A pre-assessment is one way that I do that in my classes, sending out a pre-course survey where I ask people even questions about sort of how they engage or participate in class. And knowing that information first helps me to say some things in class before we do certain activities to set it up, and then scaffold the different activities appropriately. The second point sort of connects to that. The knowledge and skills learners need to develop before encountering. So I mentioned listening earlier, and there are different, I've provided a link here to resources that help you identify if listening is going to be an important skill for later in the course. May want to do that earlier, because people might not have already had that experience. And then finally, the learner artifact of what is it that you want students to be able to produce at the end. So if it's an individual or a group debrief or reflection, they're going to create something digital, media, all of that goes into your planning and deciding which activity. Sometimes we tend to choose sort of the easy method of a reflection, of an individual reflection, written reflection. But when you have, sort of that pre-assessment, knowing what skills and knowledge students are bringing into the classroom, that can do a lot in terms of allowing them opportunities to choose from options acceptable to you, because you don't need to grade a whole lot of things if you're in a kind of course setting like I am, of different things. You don't want to have to do that, but being very intentional and clear about knowing what they will be producing at the end. Again, tying back to your goals and aligning those very clearly. Kris, anything you want to add to this before we get to assessment?
No, I think you did a great job.
All right.
So we are going to move into assessment now. So again, thinking in terms of backward design, we need some mechanism to know if we have actually reached that desired outcome that we identified at the beginning. So this is all about how do we as facilitators, as mentors, as teachers know that folks have developed, and how do they know, how can they see their own development and progress? So the obvious thing to start with, because we are aligned with the AAC&U value rubrics in this series, is of course the Intercultural Knowledge and Competence value rubric. And the most common way that I have seen this rubric applied is either as a whole, or in this case, piecemeal. If you're just focusing on openness, you can take that one row from the rubric and you can use it to evaluate learning artifacts. So it's most commonly done, in my experience, with written assignments, such as reflective journals or maybe discussion posts or some kind of paper. And the nice thing about something like this is that you don't actually have to assign credit for it. You can assess without evaluating for a grade. So this is an example of a rubric that I pulled from a Brightspace course. You could put it in Canvas or Moodle or whatever learning platform that you happen to use if you do, in fact, evaluate learners online. And so this just shows you that you can grade based on something like the quality of the submission, or whether it was turned in on time, or whether it meets the sort of intent of the assignment, whether they treated it thoroughly and thoughtfully, and give points for that. But you can also score on the rubric without assigning any points. And that allows you to give learners feedback without making their grade dependent on where they are on that rubric. So you see here the AAC&U value rubric for openness is here, but also the intercultural development continuum would be another way to give feedback in that way. But there are two other ways that I've seen the rubrics used and used myself, and I think I just want to mention as options for you. So this is a lot less common, but I think it can be a useful tool for observational feedback. So you could have a dialogue. You could use 5 nosy questions. You could use any of these other dialogue type tools that we introduced today, and then use the rubric to either provide feedback on what you observed, or as a number 3, have the learners use the rubric as a self-evaluative tool so that they can plot themselves based on their experience there. And you can do it as a self-evaluation tool, or even as an observation or a written reflection overlay on top of assignments. You can do that either cross-sectionally, just at one point of time, or you can do it longitudinally, so that you might do it as a formative assessment at the beginning of an experience, maybe even several times throughout an extended, longer-term experience, and then maybe at the end, where people can really see their trajectory of growth over that series of assignments. Okay, so we're going to present a few other options beyond the AAC&U value rubric for assessment for you. And as we present these, just as a sort of outline or summary of our main points, we want to be sure that folks understand that technology is a beautiful gift to be used. So I think, Horane, you're on for this section.
Sure. I'll just run through these briefly because I want to make sure we have enough time for questions that are popping up in the chat. So when thinking about the formative assessments, these are assessments that we have designed, that others have developed, that really help to track progress throughout. So it's not fully summative in the sense that, okay, you get you'll be necessarily evaluated on this and this will be your final score, but it's an opportunity to facilitate reflection. And as Kris mentioned, using Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or different ones, we'll demonstrate a few. And we want you to think about this because we don't want you to recreate the wheel. I've been down that road before, and I was like, oh, I could just look this up and see someone has done something like this. The other piece is automated feedback. The ones we're going to share with you, they're already built within Qualtrics is the one we use, and you'll have access to it to download it, and we can share copies with you. but it's already built an automated feedback to learners to facilitate their reflections, and you could actually go in and modify those things. So we're going to give you 3 examples of this. You can go to the next slide, Kris. So the first one is the Ask Short skill. So myself, Heidi Parker-Rushan, this call, and Chuck Callahan, while I was at Purdue, we developed this tool called the Attitude, Skills, and Knowledge Short Skills. It's based on the Intercultural Knowledge and Competence value rubric. And we intentionally just took statements from the value rubric at the benchmark level and the highest level, and transform them into statements that students could reflect on. What you're seeing here is what we call the construct key. So we design statements for the whole rubric, not just openness, all the attitude, skills, and knowledge that are there. You could bring in the other one. So these links here show directly to the Hubble where you can find the tool, and then also the tiny URL link. If you type that into your web browser, it will take you directly to the assessment itself. Below are just some screenshots. These assessments are not, we didn't sort of design them in a way with checking for social desirability. So what you might find is, for example, on the first statement, I welcome and initiate interactions with people who are culturally different, which is one of the items related to openness. Someone might feel like, oh, sure I am. And that's what they think or aspire to be, but not what they actually, that's not their particular approach. So with the, how we have designed this is to have prompts that prepare students to take the assessment. So they have to read through that first part. There's a screenshot of welcome, inviting them to read through the page before. And then they enter their information to get the automated email at the end. So that's set up. And then the way I've designed this one is, when are they completing the assessment? So instead of creating 3 different links for the pre, the retrospect, the post, when they're doing it, you would have one link that you give to them, and they'd select the time, and it's designed to walk them through the process already, just depending on when they're completing the assessment. But this is great for you in determining your own goals for student learning, because all the constructs are there, the attitudes, as well as them monitoring their own learning. This is a screenshot of what they get in their emails once it's completed, just a brief narrative about the skill, where their responses place them, and then some reflection questions. These you can modify. And I put in where at the end, so download as a PDF with Qualtrics, you can just have them upload that to the system instead of you having them forward you all the emails. You can click again, Kris. Yes. So as you said, we're happy to share these with you. Just send an email to me, hholgate@nd.edu, and it's also on the slides. You'll have access to that. And we could share. These links here just tell you how to access the survey once you have shared it. Make a copy for yourself so that you could go and play with it and use it in your class.
So I'm going to very briefly talk about 2 other options. All 3 of these, the asks, the MGoods, and the tolerance for ambiguity scale, are open access, so you don't have to pay to use them. And so that's a great advantage. They're also fairly short, so it's not going to take you hours, to do the assessment each time. It's more like 10 minutes. And the one difference that I wanted to point out between the AAC&U value rubrics and these 3 scales that we're talking about is that the AAC&U value rubrics also open access and free to use. But with the value rubrics, there's an emphasis on potentially adapting them to your context. Whereas with these 3 scales that we're introducing, they're validated statistically. So you don't want to change items on them. So if you copy something, one of these for your own use, you can change demographics, you can change the introductory language or the automated feedback to your learners, but don't change the items themselves, because it's been statistically sort of tested to make sure it's actually measuring what it is and that the items make sense and are doing a good job as a survey. Okay, so the MGoods is the Melville-Guzman Universality Diversity Short Scale, which is why we always say MGoods. And it also is in Qualtrics. There's a copy there that we're happy to share with you, and then you can copy it and use it for yourself if you have a Qualtrics account. And I just put a couple of sample items up here from it. It doesn't say openness in the title, but I would argue very strongly that openness is one of the constructs that it is measuring. So you can see that kind of from the items here. It's less in the suspending judgment piece and more in the willingness to interact across differences, definitely. And then the last one is the tolerance for ambiguity scale. This has been around for a while as well, a couple of decades, and it's different from the other two because the other two are a little bit broader. The asks and the M-goods have several constructs involved in them, whereas the tolerance for ambiguity scale is very, very specific on this one very clearly delineated concept of tolerance for ambiguity. This is just an example from the feedback email, and I put it up here because I wanted people to see that one of the values of doing formative assessment like this is to encourage reflection on the part of the learners. And so you can give them their score on a survey like this and then use it as an assignment for them to think deeply about what the survey says about them and how they feel about it and why they think they got that score and what they want to do about it. So it can be a really useful teaching tool as formative assessment. So we're out of time for our presentational piece of this. I'm going to turn it over to Horane for a quick summary, and then we're going to move to Annette for the Q&A time and wrap up.
Yeah, so I mean, here's what we said we were going to do, right? By the end of the session, we wanted you to be able to describe intercultural openness, and we shared with you that it has these two components, being able to initiate interactions with people who are culturally different and suspending judgment. And we hope you could take those and apply them in your specific context based on the different experiential learning activities that we shared and all the assessments that we went over. I know we gave you a lot of information in like 75 minutes, but I would say if one thing I'd say go back to those planning and implementation slides, thinking about intentionally about backward design to help you think about what is it that I want students to be able to do by the end. What is the relevant activities and what is that artifact of their learning that you're going to need to evaluate? Yeah.
So there's all the ways you can get involved with CILMAR. We would welcome hearing from you, especially at cilmar@purdue.edu. Just send us a quick email. We'd love that. Would you make it go, please? Thank you. So the Intercultural Learning Hub is an arm of the Center for Intercultural Learning, Mentorship, Assessment, and Research. We are about to begin testing on how to offer you all badges and micro-credentials for attending this session, but that would come through the Intercultural Learning Hub. So we never ask you for money. The use of the hub is totally free, but you will need an account in order to get those micro-credentials and badges retrospectively. If you attend 3 sessions that are listed as either global learning or intercultural learning, those 3 sessions will add up to the next badge in either global learning or intercultural learning. You'll get more information from me about that in an email. As I said before, we always love to hear from you, so please give us your feedback so we can just keep continuing to get better. Thank you so much for attending. It's been wonderful seeing all of you.
Thanks. We really appreciate it. Dawn, do you have any words of conclusion if you want to jump back in here as our host?
No, just thank you and Horane for this wonderful session. And we hope that we will see you again throughout this series. We welcome you back and look forward to continuing the learning.
Thanks. We hope to see you in later sessions in the series.